What's up, everybody? This is LibUX, the podcast about design and user experience for libraries in the higher ed web. Coming up, Joe Marquez, the author of Library Service Design, in just 3, 2... So welcome to the podcast.
Great, thank you for having me.
I'm super honored to have you here. The first episode in January that Amanda and I aired was a kind of like a library design trends episode where we tried to anticipate like the next 10 big trends. And so in the last few years it's been like user experience design, user experience this, user experience that, user studies, etc. So our number one trend that we ended up like agreeing on was that whereas UX was sort of the library buzzword du jour of 2014 and 2015, in 2016 it's going to be the dawn of service design for libraries. And then lo and behold, like your book comes out 6 months after we do that.
I would agree. I've seen an increase in that whole word, the whole concept at conferences that I've been to. And so it's great.
I'm curious, which conferences have you gone to where that's come up?
I've seen it at Design for Digital in Austin. That was in April.
1 second. So you were there?
I was there.
Me too. I was
okay.
there.
So,
did we bump into each other or anything?
Who knows? Maybe. Let's see. Where else have I seen it? Or also places that I'm talking to. So I'm in Oregon, so at the Oregon Library Association. And so for the most part, there's public libraries. But people are kind of into it. Once we explain what this whole concept is, they're like, oh yeah, I could totally adapt that to my library. And
So let's round that out. So for those who are listening for the first time, or they're coming out of the UX field, or maybe they're just library folk who have some interest, service design, define it.
That's a tough question. Let's see. What is it? It is a holistic take on the user experience. So the user experience is, like you were saying, it was a buzzword at one point, and it usually refers to the UI. And I think it's beyond. The user experience is just like walking in the door. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What does your library look like? And so it's this holistic, meaning we're going to look at all aspects of it, all aspects of a user's experience, and look at all the systems that go into that create the experience, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's exactly what we've been pushing in not the LibUX, but the larger library UX field. These are, the books by Amanda Etches and Aaron Schmidt, and some of the other UX things. The workshops and things that we've written with capitalized LibUX have all been kind of trying to push this definition of user experience outside of the UI and off the web to describe like signage and atmosphere and things that are holistic and physical.
Right.
So we've been trying to get to like a service design thing, I think, for a long time before we've had maybe the vocabulary for it.
Right, and I think this concept, it says service design, and I think some people they are confused because they don't see everything as a service, and I think that's the difference between, say, user experience design is that we're looking at everything as a service. So if I'm at an academic institution, so one of my students comes in and he or she uses a table in my library, they decided to use the library as opposed to commons or the cafeteria or their dorm room or whatever, and so they decided to use that area. So they're essentially using that table as a service. That's up to them. And so I think looking at things in the service perspective really changes our perspective, I guess.
Do user experience designers and service designers coexist, or does one supplant the other?
This is what I always say, is that we're not in competition. It's just a matter of what tool do you want to use for the job you have to do? So the end goal is the same, is to better anyone's personal experience with a service or an experience or something. And so it's just a matter of like, I think services for me, because we're in libraries, we're a service profession, it makes sense from this perspective to look at how people are using everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this has been something that, has been part of library land for such a long time. The literature goes back so far talking about, the reference services and the services that libraries provide the community that I think almost just the keyword makes it easier to sell service design. I mean, there's a little bit of a niche in just writing articles about like how to convince stakeholders that user studies and user experience design matters, but maybe that requires a lot less work because it's already using language that is natural to us.
Right, and to some, I mean, there was a period in libraries like, we want to be at the same table, we're going to be partners, and I think the way we get to be partnership, especially in academia, in academic libraries, is that you provide a really solid foundation for the services you deliver. I don't personally, the word service is not a bad word. It doesn't mean like we're butlers and maids in an episode of Downton Abbey. It just means this is what we do. Services actually are like over 70% of U.S. GDP. We're no longer really a manufacturing country. It's like services are essential to what we do and how this country in the current economy works. And so it's just I guess it's an outgrowth of that.
Yeah, I think of Apple and Apple products, which are sort of the consummate of what user experience or the experience or the culmination of the product and its aesthetic. And even they are moving toward they've announced that they are moving toward a more services-oriented model. Uber, the service, I think this is long since elevated beyond like, maid services or low service. And I think maybe there was probably a point where you think about that and you're like, this is incredibly, blue collar and subservient, but it's not really the case.
And that isn't the case. I mean, you're absolutely correct. There's a great article by Don Norman, and I'm totally forgetting the title, but he writes essentially about services and how people consume items. So Apple's a perfect example. So you have an iPhone, you could use an Android, doesn't matter, your smartphone. But it's we use it as a service. I use it as a service to access my email, to access my social media, to take pictures of my kids, little things like that. And then it's connected to this other cloud mechanism, this all supporting infrastructure. Essentially, I'm using it as a service. I just don't, unless you get a couple people in a room who think about this stuff and kind of like take it apart bit by bit, most people are just going to say, this is my phone, right? But they don't necessarily look at it as a service.
So let's say we have everybody on board. What does library administration, the organization at large is like on board. We agree. It's like this vocabulary works for us. We have long since called ourselves a services organization. What then do the service designers, plural, do?
We would be looking at. So this is where we're at the. I mean, that's a really good question. We're essentially at the table. We're kind of part of like a strategy table because we're understanding, okay, we can make a service blueprint is a tool that we can make and say, okay, patron comes in and she wants a book. And so we can do everything behind the scenes. What does it take for us to get the book to the patron into her hands? Provided we're talking about like a print book. And so, or even an electronic book. What are the various services? What are the people who are involved going to need to do in order to make this experience successful? So where do we fit in? I think we're at the planning table, right? So it's not just like the planning how services are physically developed. in our library, but also what about the buildings? As we're going through renovations, let's talk about what is the experience currently versus what is the current expectations and needs going forward. And so this person is essential and really key in how the library delivers its services going forward. Too bad we don't have a nickel for every time we say the word service during this exchange, but we're going to say it a lot.
There's a user experience drinking game that folks can Google, and there's definitely going to be a service design. Other words might be like blueprint, touch point.
Yeah, exactly.
This is totally random. It doesn't dovetail at all with what you just said, but so the service design vocabulary is interesting. I think we're going to round back out and talk a little bit about the service blueprint because. Googling service design, doing kind of like a cursory, like getting the feel of sort of the lay of the land. Service blueprint is probably the most popular method or technique that you'll run into. Yeah. And we'll definitely talk a little bit about that. But I just got caught up in my own mind thinking about some of the vocabulary. So blueprint and touch point, I think these make sense, and especially as like I guess what I consider myself more as a user experience designer, these gel with what our journey maps. These are almost the exact same tool. However, have you encountered language describing the service in terms of like a theater stage, front stage, and backstage? Yeah.
So let's see. Hang on one second.
Yeah, no problem.
So what I'm getting, I'm in my office right now as we're talking, and I have all my books behind me. There's a great book called The Experience Economy by Joseph Pine and James Gilmore. And if you were to look at my copy, it has all these little flags on it where I reference different points, and they're in the book that I co-wrote with Annie Downey. And so, but it's service is about performance. And it's theater. You can totally script it out. You can script a lot of it out. One thing you don't have is the actual interaction. What is the patron bringing to the table, literally? And so, are they in a good mood, bad mood? What about the service provider? Are they in a good mood, bad mood? What's going to happen? And so, you could talk about a fast food place, you could talk about a bank, you could talk about the library. But yeah, it's total theater, and it's all scripted. You look at a chain like Starbucks, their whole, you can go into any Starbucks, whether you're in California, Oregon, Florida, whatever, and it's going to be roughly the same experience. And that's all scripted out. But I don't know, do we have to have libraries that well scripted out? It helps with the user experience. If I know how to check out a book, I can go into your library and know what to do. Versus you coming into my library and knowing what to do.
I think.
Did I answer your question, or did I?
Yeah, totally? No. I think so. This is something that I've been reading pretty heavily about going forward with some of my own projects. But the front stage, backstage lingo has sort of been hard for me to wrap my mind around. It was just been I understood it, but it was just sort of a grind. Except right now, you just mentioned that like the service is performance, and somehow I've never encountered that. Like when people launch into a some sort of like technique or model or whatever, and they're trying to describe front stage, backstage, the curtain drop, like things like this. It was always without the kind of like the connective tissue that the service is performance. So it's just a kind of like a brief epiphany, but it's useful. And again, I guess it makes sense if you think about kind of the history of service design. Before there was such a thing, the customer service has always been about forward presentation. The even user experiences organized around the successful performance of a product. Like if something isn't pulled off correctly, well, it fails, and it fails not because the product itself is dysfunctional, but it fails because the end user, determines that it fails.
Right, or the service provider, right? So if we're not training the frontline staff in how to do basic customer service, And I'm not saying it's a blank check, customers always right language, but it just like, what do you do? How are you a professional going up to the circ desk, going up to the reference desk or information desk, whatever? How do you act? And so, yeah, it's a little bit of performance, and there's a little bit of, or a lot of, just kind of winging it. You never know what's going to happen because you can control only so much. And we can't even create the experience, but we can remove all sorts of barriers known barriers. And that's where the research comes in to say, okay, this is our foundation. Now it really depends on the two individuals. If it's a person to person, it depends on their action, because services are essentially, they're intangible. We can't possess them. And they're also co-created at the point of exchange. And that's something to take into consideration, something that's kind of like out of our hands. There's this concept called emotional labor, and that's something out of sociology. And it's just like the amount of effort and caring, empathy on the service provider side to take care of the service interaction. And that's something also to kind of look into, along with like performance and all this pre-scripting and stuff.
And one thing I think that's important to take away is that it's not just the moment or the actions of, like, take customer service, or let's library this up a bit. Let's take like the reference services. It's not just the behavior and the attitude of like the person on one side of the desk engaging with that of the other. It also very much relies on sort of, I guess this is where the concept of like the backstage happens. It relies on the policies, the barriers that the service providers put onto themselves, the technical hurdles to be able to carry out their service, but even things like cultural or organizational barriers. Yeah. And so one of the things that I really like about service design, and I think service design, I've kind of like I think I have a fairly successful rationalization that puts service design and user experience design at kind of on the same continuum. Mm-hmm. But in general, one of the things I like about service design, which I think is incredibly compelling, is this notion that whereas rather than focusing attention on the even just the, I guess, like the performance or the end product of the service or the website or the experience of this, it requires that it requires kind of like an internal deconstruction to see which barriers that have no real I don't know what I'm saying, no real not impact with the customer, because they're so far buried, but they impact the success of everything else. I kind of muddled my way through that, but I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's where that whole holistic concept comes in, because we're going to look at everything, right? And so and we're going to understand, hopefully, all the culture that the background culture that goes into like how we deliver services the way we do in this year. So this is we have this concept. We wrote it in the book, and we wrote in a previous article about doing customer journey maps, is the idea of the inherited ecology. So rarely do you and I get to invent our own library. We have essentially inherited a physical building, a website, which we can adapt, but we all have all these services. And you also have, the biggest issue is culture, this organizational culture that's just kind of like hanging over everyone. And sometimes it's like an anchor, and sometimes, it's, I don't know, a halo. I don't know what the opposite of an anchor would be. But it's so how are we, sometimes you'll hear in meetings, oh, that's how we just do things, or that's how it's always been done. Well, why? That's where you have to say, well, why? Because the students, let's see, this is my fourth year at this institution, so I've seen the students who came in as freshmen or first years, they finally graduated. And it's a big change from the students 4 years ago to the students who are going to come in now. They just have a different sense of reality. And so for us, it's just like, how are we going to adapt the inherited ecology to meet the current needs? So my library's main building was built in 1930. Well, the student of 1930 is different from the student of 2016. And so how do we adapt it? Without the wrecking ball, how do we adapt it? And so also within means. This is where you don't like put everyone into bankruptcy. But it's how do we adapt it within means?
One of our listeners, Ashley Middleton, asked whether it is possible to innovate or change without strong leadership. Is it possible to apply this kind of thinking without, I guess, organizational buy-in?
Well, do you want to keep your job? No, okay, so let's say, so one thing that we could do is, it could be like little things. This is a really cool stuff about the cool aspect of doing any kind of user testing. And it's not strictly just about service design. It could be doing ethnography or anything like that. One thing that we found is that students had trouble in one of our studies. Students had trouble every now and then. They would get stuck under desks, under tables when they're sitting in certain chairs. And wait. Yeah, go ahead.
Rephrase that or explain that. So
okay.
They're sitting down and then they get stuck in them.
Yeah, so they would scooch themselves under. The chairs all have armrests, and the armrests would essentially get stuck. They would get wedged underneath this table.
Oh, I understand. Yeah.
Right. And so we have 30 of these tables, and then we have tons of these chairs. And I'm thinking, why does that happen? That doesn't happen because they're all the same. And so we had to go back and we talked to our administrative assistant, and she says, oh, this is what happens. Those chairs break every now and then. We put them on the loading dock, they disappear, and then they come back. Facilities fixes them, but they fix them with parts from the previous chairs that were broken. So what we get back is these Franken chairs, and every now and then they get stuck because some are taller than others. And I didn't know that, but you don't know that unless you actually ask, what's it like to sit out there? So, every now and then we should probably be like, hey, let's be a user for a week and go sit in there and try to work like they do. I'm
curious. You have to finish the scenario now. So what did you guys do?
Oh, no. So for us, the thing is just knowing that exists. So what are we going to do about that? I mean, maybe this is where I guess I could go back and talk to the admin and say, hey, can we measure the chairs and make sure facilities cuts them to X number of inches tall, a leg or whatever, so we don't have this issue. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, unless I go through with a tape measure and, school starts in 2 weeks, I guess I could go measure 100 chairs and see which ones are gonna get stuck.
That's an interesting observation. That's so bizarre.
Yeah, but or knowing that another silly little thing is that some of the outlets and the floors were gummed up with either dirt or students putting stuff in them, and so every now and then I would never think of an electrical outlet as part of the user experience, but it is. And so again, what's going to work, what's not going to work, and but yeah, sorry, that was kind of tangential, but
no, it's good. So by improving these things, even at a little scale, I think what's true in any of those disciplines is that basically all ships rise with the tide. I wonder though. So I've been I just wrote this article for I think like the October issue of Computers in Libraries. There's this basically feature prediction tool that I love called the Kano model. One of the key takeaways of the Kano model is that it's sort of like the blend of features, not a single feature or whatever that shapes kind of a user experience. However, while all ships rise with the tides, it is also true that all ships lower with the tide as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so I mean, I think I think taking everything into consideration is essential, right? And understanding all the little facets that make the overall experience.
Ashley, this listener who responded to my call for questions, she kind of goes off on that former question saying, okay, like given an unideal situation in which you don't have this organizational buy-in, she writes that she would be curious about successful ways or techniques that you have maybe gotten staff who would otherwise be stubbornly comfortable within the current system to try some of these new things. She adds that she saw Richard Collada who is Rhode Island's first chief innovation officer, speak at the Distance Teaching and Learning Conference just last week from when we recorded this. And he suggested framing things like, this is a pilot, this is in beta, this is just what we're trying now. So it's kind of like a psychological game to get people to make that first step.
Yeah, right. So back to the leadership, it's great, is that that was one thing I wanted buy-in from our head librarian, and we did. But one thing that worked in our favor was that we were gaining tons of evidence. This is why this is what we're finding. And as a result of that, this is what we prescribe as kind of like a solution. And so I think if you have the evidence, it's really hard to argue against the evidence, unless that you need a new building. Then it's a matter of it's a financial decision. But without the leadership, there was one question that I had a lot during our process when we were actually using this the first time around was why. So let me back up. Our project, I'm chair of this group called the Library User Experience Group. And originally, our first mission was to look at the website, and then we were asked, well, you know what? Can you look at the physical touch points, the desk, service desk? Yeah, sure. Why not? I'm not going to say no, right? And then I was asked, well, can we look at the physical space? And this is where I said, oh, hang on, I don't know how to do that. And so I discovered in quotes service design as I was working on my MBA at the time at Portland State, and I was looking at design thinking and said, oh, there's got to be something for services, and I saw this thing called service design. But what the question that I kept getting was, here we are looking at physical space and service delivery, and people were saying, why is the web guy, I'm the web services librarian, why is the web guy looking at physical space? And so it was really tough, and every time I had to justify, this is why we're doing it. This is kind of like, it all makes sense to me in my head, but I have to explain the whole, what does the user experience mean? And I think people have bought into it. And also, part of this process is getting people involved. So your library staffers, paraprofessionals, even students or, volunteers in your library, they're actually part of your stakeholder group. It's not just about, we're not just totally catering to the customer or the patron, but we're also looking at the service provider too. And that's essential. And when people see that their opinion matters, they will they'll weigh in and they'll feel appreciated. How about that?
Yeah, it's this whole notion that that the investment in the services that you provide, the personal investment, returns with morale. I think there's a lot of writing. Some of the service design for business written by XYZ. I'll make sure to link it in the show notes. Mentions that one of the first services you should, if you're able, focus on are the services that you provide your employees. And by that, I don't think he means, the benefits or the salary, but it's the impact basically, the impact on that organizational inertia, trying to chip away at that so that as you turn your sights toward public-facing services, you move at a much quicker pace. It's easier to iterate. That the iteration culture is already part of the deal, and the end results become better and bigger.
Right. I think getting feedback from both sides of the table is really key, right? Because then you get people invested in their own work. And so that's essential. But I think in any case, I'm totally forgetting his name now, but it's all about, a lot of it is about culture. That's like the biggest issue anywhere. And so how do you, without that, going back to the question of leadership, how do you get people involved? I mean, you ask them, you show them evidence, and eventually you say, oh, this is actually going to make our patrons, our users, our customers happier. It's really hard to argue with that.
Have you tried to tie service design to a return on tangible investment? Like, we're going to improve this, and thus our circulation numbers are going to increase.
That's a good no. So my answer is no. But that is something. That's something that definitely should be looking into, because one thing that we heard was, I remember these two students saying, "I know I have a librarian, but I don't know where they are. I don't know how to find them." So we have, in academic libraries, you have liaison duties, and so certain librarians are assigned to certain departments. And so for a student, for my institution, they have a thesis component in their senior year, so they really work closely with the librarian. And so for them, maybe more questions is that return on investment.
Yeah,
right?
I guess it's whatever you defined a success metric as. It doesn't have to be dollar signs. It can be how many questions have we fielded? How many times have a new patron reached out to us? And I'm a web services librarian too. So, Google Analytics, you have the unique users. How many of these are repeat? How many of these are new? Are we reaching a new demographic? And, whatever the success metric is, I'm sure you could tie some sort of impact to positive or negative.
And I think that's where, like anything, you have to tailor anything to the individual library. And I think that's another thing that I love about this process, this methodology of service design, is that it's adaptable to any library. And so that's helpful.
So someone comes to you, your library administrator comes to you and says, Joe, okay, well, this is a public library example, but let's pretend. He says, Joe, we have noticed that our library card registration has dipped precipitously over the last couple of years. Can you do your service blueprint magic and look for opportunities where we can improve? And I kind of want to use this as kind of a brief excuse to sort of introduce this concept of the service blueprint and maybe how you might differentiate it from the journey map for those of us who have a preconceived notion.
Yeah, so I think one thing you have to do is, you get together a group of. So this would be hard because hard in the sense of because you're asking about people who aren't using the library, right? So your question, right? So okay, how are we going to get a focus group or a discussion group of people who don't use the library? So I guess you go into your own town, your community, and maybe you can pull people together to have a discussion. And this is where I prefer to call them discussion groups, because the point focus groups kind of like focus on here are the certain number of questions. This is what we want answered. We're looking at very specific goals. Whereas the discussion group, let's let the audience, let's let the users take us where they want to take us, and let's follow them on their journey. So I think what I would do is potentially look at create journey maps of individuals and where do they get their resources. So if we're looking at specific books or news or whatever, okay, where are you getting your information? Maybe they're getting them from some online, like an Amazon, or they're going to the local community bookstore or whatever. And so just seeing, or maybe it's an underserved population. There's an immigrant population, not native speakers of English. And so, again, what is the change in the community? So I'd want to see what the demographic is or whatever, if there's a change. We take those journey maps, and that's how we can see what we're doing differently, what are the steps taken in order to provide a service. So let's just say, for whatever reason, the get a library card, as our example, button or link was all of a sudden buried for some reason, and maybe that was the issue. Then what are the steps behind the scenes to actually get that in the forefront and easier to manage. I'm not sure if I'm justifying the process because this one's a little bit more in depth because you're looking for people who aren't current users.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay.
Provide a supper. Yeah, it's,
no. What we can do is like if we have a journey map, the journey map is the top part of is one section of the service blueprint. So that's the on stage part. The off stage part is like the systems librarian, if there's a systems person, the cataloger, all these people behind the scenes, the students or people who are the volunteers, library workers who are reshelving books. Those are all the behind the scenes, and what a normal patron might not see. So what are that's that line of demarcation, right, between on stage, off stage, and so the journey map feeds into the blueprint itself. It's a portion of it.
Let's take a journey map. The way I like to think about it is like an aerial view. You have patron Jones has this many steps to get a library card or check out a book or whatever. Yeah. Must get out of the car as a touch point. Must, like all these little steps that you take that you can define. These are little touch points.
Yeah. So
this is the journey map. So the blueprint, which I think is interesting in what I've seen, is like so if you have this aerial view, if you were to turn it, make it three-dimensional, and you were to turn it on its side, and you present like a cross section, just like earth sciences classes where you have the rain coming out of the clouds, and then it goes through the cross section of the earth, all the different sedimentary layers. And so like the blueprint is this really cool, super in-depth journey map, or it feeds from all these different touch points to really focus on not just the barriers of the off-stage things, but whereas the journey map focuses really on none of the barriers. It only looks at the grind of the interaction at that point of interaction, right. But it doesn't look at all the different people that are part of that decision-making process, or all of the different people that have worked on the policy that informs why library card registration is a 10-page form, like all these different kind of rules that feed into that interaction. So you can make the button like right up front, and it could be like blinking, and there could be like a unicorn on it, yeah, and right. That makes it easier to click. But yes. There's going to be points where your ability to make something usable kind of butts heads against that organizational inertia, that the way that things have been or are reasons for doing business, whatever reasons we have for making really long forms, our technical limitations, what our CMS is, like all these different things that otherwise don't seem at all like singularly attached to this one touch point, determines whether or not that touch point is hard to use, and
yeah, I think that was a really good explanation of the blueprint. I mean, it's I did a workshop at a local university over here, and there was one guy who was just like, he's like, let's just do a blueprint on everything. And I'm like, you're just going to occupy the rest of your life doing that. But we were, Annie and I had given this workshop, and so we were saying, oh yeah, you do the service blueprint at the end, because essentially, like an architectural blueprint, this is how it should be. But then the thought came into both of our heads, like, you know what, there's no reason it should be at the end. What if you do it at the beginning? And this is how it's done. And then you can see as it evolves, as you go through the process, so, okay, these are all the behind-the-scenes steps that go into making sure some sort of process or whatever service is executed correctly or well, whatever. And so one thing that what you could do is, you could use it as some sort of metric to see stages of evolution into how you refine the service.
Oh,
right?
Interesting.
Or how you eliminate it. When you do the blueprint, then you can say, oh, you know what? This is a process that it only requires 3 steps, but we have 5 steps and 3 hands touching it. Well, there's no reason we need all the people involved. And it's not to eliminate jobs, but it's just like, how are we going to make ourselves more efficient so that we can do other things? And we're busy enough in libraries, so like, why make ourselves any busier than we need to? And so that I think the blueprint is really good as far as not only instructions on how we're going to do services going forward or a process or something, but you can also see how do we need to have them evolve? Where are their pinch points? Because the pinch points definitely come up on the customer side, but what about our side? What about the off-stage side?
I think the blueprint is maybe like the best hook into service design, mainly because there's sort of like an addictive quality to it, right? It's just like, you're just kind of grooming out all these little things that have accumulated over not just maybe like years of service, but decades, depending on the library, which I think, libraries provide this really kind of like, just as, library web design is its own like unique thing because there's so many different unique patron bases, like the service design for libraries is itself incredibly complicated because some libraries have existed for, I don't know, a century. And there's all this baggage and there's all this esteem. I like that term that you used, this, the organizational ecology. What was it?
Inherited ecology.
Oh, it's so perfectly like describes even like inherited assumptions from the community, right? So New York has an idea of what it expects from New York Public Library, and it's not just an immediate reflection of what they're doing now, but it's what they've been doing for years and years and years and years. And on the same flip side, I mean, if you have a library that for whatever reason is determined to be like routinely underperforming for years and years and years and years, you can do a complete 180, but you're going to still have this kind of like baggage, the baggage of the building itself, the baggage of the assumptions that people have made.
Totally, yeah, and I mean, right? Why is it that we do the things we do, right? And so who knows who made this decision? Right, like you were saying, this decision could have been made 20 years ago, and this is just how we do things, and no one ever questioned it because who knows? Maybe that person was a really strong personality, and they didn't want any changes or any questioning of their decision making. So we have this inherited ecology that we just have to adapt, and it's a willingness to evolve, which is always a really tough thing. Change is never easy, and so I think again, it's almost going back to that leadership question. It's how you deliver the information. This is why it might be good to make a change, or this is going to benefit us for X, Y, and Z reasons, and so. It's not just doing the research, it's also like maybe sometimes sugarcoating the results a little bit, right? Yours
and book Library Service Design can help folks like address some of that, right?
Yes. One would hope, right?
Let's take a moment to show your book right now because it's the first of like perhaps like many, just like there's several UX books.
Yes. And that's the thing. There was, so I was thinking about this. There was one time when we were writing this, the publisher, they sent us the cover, and I think it finally dawned on me that this was going to be a physical thing. I said library service design, and I said, can we change it to service design in libraries? And the publisher said no. It's already been set. And I'm like, okay. So I kind of I grappled with that. And then I thought about, what? It's exactly what you just said. Web design for libraries is, for some reason, it's slightly different than web design for the rest of the world. And I think the same thing goes for service design. We have to adapt it because in most cases, in a lot of these big consulting firms that I see in Europe or in the bigger cities in the U.S., is they're looking for for-profit companies or institutions that they're working with. And so for us, we just have to adapt it because, the physical space, what we deliver physically in the library is so essential. It's part of the fabric of who we are. And that's one thing in all my research, I really didn't find where they talked about physical space as a point of delivery, but it really is. And I think I think that's where it's really unique to how libraries hopefully interpret service design. But who knows? I could be wrong. and I'm willing to have this discussion with anyone. But it's been a lot of fun, and I just I like the finished product, and hopefully others do too. We'll see.
No, I think you are spot on. So where can people reach out to you to discuss this or to find your book? Where and you know, and Anne too. She wasn't able to join us, but
well, they can buy the book on Amazon. If they want to talk to me, my Twitter handle is JOUGHM on there, and then both Annie and I are currently working at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, so library.reed.edu. You can reach us through there. There's a website that I created for the book. It's libraryservicedesign.com, nice. And I'm still working on the website. So I meant to be a little bit faster related to the publishing of the book, but it's a work in progress. So.
Awesome. Very cool. I would love to have you back on to talk more about, like, maybe more specific things. I'd love to go further into this organizational ecology. Oh, my gosh, I can't say it. Inherited ecology. Yeah. And I think of organizational inertia, and and they're hand in hand. Lastly, you have a course coming up, right?
Yes. I'm teaching an online course at Library Juice. That's going to be in October. And so...
And people can sign up now. This is I think I saw this go out to like Code for Lib and some of the other listeners.
Yeah, it's definitely on now. And then Annie and I were asked to write a workbook. So more of this is more of the library service design book that we just published is more of like a theoretical, philosophical, but it's also there's a lot of actionable items in there. But ALA said, hey, can you do something more like a workbook? And so we're in the process. We just had a meeting. And so we are in the process of working on a workbook that should be out next year by the time ALA Annual in 2017.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Are you going to be at Design for Digital next year?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will be there. And then we're also gonna be speaking at ALA Annual on a panel discussion with panel group with someone from IDEO and someone from Internet Archive. And so
very cool.
That should be exciting.
And for those just kind of hearing that, IDEO are the design thinking people.
Yeah. So that was kind of like a feather in my cap and kind of like, whoa, am I ready for this? But yeah, why not? Come on.
Well, very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us on LibUX.
Thank you. It's been great.